Should OPEC oil producers increase output to help stabilize oil prices and help prevent another global recession? And should the world take lessons in banking reform from West Africa? My guest today has been challenging vested interests in Nigeria and challenging them so fiercely that his personal security has been stepped up. As governor of the central bank, Lamido Sanusi sacked the managers of Nigeria's top private banks and put many of them in court. But can he win against the system? Lamido Sanusi, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
Do you fear another global recession?
I think it's a risk that cannot be ruled out. What's happening in the Middle East and the fact that there isn't very much fiscal space in most of Europe and the United States would suggest that the avenues for increasing fiscal stimulus and pursuing counter-cyclical measures are highly limited. Now, all depends on what happens to oil price. But remember in 2007, 2008, it went to $147 a barrel. And nothing happened. I mean, the economies continue to grow. If that is the case, then probably the risk is manageable. But I think it is a risk that cannot be ruled out.
And when you look at it from a Nigerian perspective, do you rub your hands and think, well, that's oil revenue, price goes up, we get more?
I wish it was that simple. Unfortunately, we also import a lot of our energy. So while we do earn more from the sale of exports of crude oil, we also spend more importing refined petroleum products, and that adds to government deficits because the government subsidizes petroleum products in Nigeria. Until we fix our refineries and actually refine our oil and reduce our dependence on imported energy, we will not be totally insulated from all shocks. So we're in a strange situation where we're an oil producer, but it's not entirely always good news when oil price goes up.
And the US Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke told the US Senate Banking Committee that prolonged rises in oil prices would pose a danger to the US economy. Now, Nigeria, of course, exports a lot of oil to the United States. At this point, should it be producing more in order to help bring down prices, stabilize prices?
Well, I'm sure if Nigeria could produce more to increase government revenues and increase our foreign reserves, we would. But we are bound by OPEC quotas, and we would be bound by the agreements that we have as members of OPEC.
And is it just that? Because the Nigerian Petroleum Corporation has said there's very little spare production capacity. Is that true?
Yes, until the petroleum industry bill is passed and we have investments in that sector, I think we're not going to get a lot of production capacity.
And why is that? I mean, what exactly is holding it up?
Well, there were delays, partly because the oil companies themselves were fighting the bill, also because there was a tortuous process of political negotiation. You've got large oil companies negotiating the fiscal terms. You've got the Nigerian government trying to improve the terms. You've got all sorts of interests in between. There has been a stated commitment by the legislature to pass that law within this session. And if it is passed, that should open the space for more investments in the sector.
And of course, the context for concern about oil prices and oil production is, as you mentioned, the turmoil in the Middle East and in North Africa. And you yourself have said that Nigeria is in danger of being next. How?
Well, I didn't quite say so. What I did say is that if we don't address the problems that we have, then it is possible that it would happen in Nigeria. A lot of people look at stability and they don't look at the intrinsic violence in a system. You've got income distribution inequalities, you've got people who are out of job, you've got a problem with the educational system, and that is the blueprint for what happened in the Middle East. Now, the lesson is that it's not just about elections, it's about people's livelihood, people losing hope in the future, and we need to address those concerns.
Well, we'll come back to the wider problems of the economic system and Nigeria's political institutions in a moment, but let's first deal with the institution that you're responsible for. And 2 years ago, your first big test as governor of the central bank was dealing with the aftermath of the global banking crisis, and you did what central governors everywhere else did. You bailed out the big private banks, but you went further and you sacked a lot of the senior management and you put many of them in court. Theft, fraud, market manipulation, some of the charges. Was the Nigerian crisis different from elsewhere? Was it more criminal than elsewhere?
Well, I don't know. I've heard there have been indications that in other parts of the world there have been laws broken. We've heard stories about investment bankers influencing rating agencies, for example, to give false ratings to products, and we've not seen any prosecutions. What we said was, if it costs us so much money to bail out the banks, individuals had to be held responsible. And certainly in the case of Nigeria, we had cases of clear fraud, theft, bad loans, and bad disclosure. And we wanted to make people account for their actions.
Yeah, you say accountable, you say make them responsible, but you also have said of those on trial they're not going to walk into jail, and we don't know the extent to which they will try to compromise due process. Now we're 2 years on, and most of these trials are mired in legal argument. What is going on?
It will continue, but at the end of the day, there will be an end. I mean, all these delays in the court process, frivolous injunctions, will get rid of all those pre-trial injunctions. The evidence is there. One of the CEOs already has confessed and basically taken a short sentence and returned a lot of the money that was taken away. And we do think we're going to get convictions of at least 2 or 3 others. The evidence is very hard. I have no doubt in my mind that more will go to jail.
2 or 3 others?
At least 3, yeah.
And so when you say holding accountable and holding responsible, some of those responsible will not be held accountable?
Those that we find evidence on will go to jail. We're going to continue prosecuting. Remember, there are also 164 people before the Investment and Securities Tribunal. So there are different levels of prosecution. There are administrative charges, there are charges before the IST, and there are criminal cases. And
you said, as I mentioned, that you thought some might try to compromise due process. Is there a problem with the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission or with the courts?
No, but certainly when people have a lot of commercial capital, if they have a lot of money, they try to use it to get out of trouble. And they will try, either with the judiciary or with the banks or with the regulators or with the police, and see, or with politicians, and see if the wealth that they have can get them out of trouble.
And sometimes it's commercial capital, as you say, and sometimes it's political capital, because we've seen more than a dozen former state governors and ministers facing graft charges. Their cases also still languishing. I'm just interested in your confidence, rather puzzled by your confidence that you will get more convictions.
Well, I have had a lot of support from the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission. We've had prosecutions and we've had great success in the one case that we had a conviction on. And we continue to monitor the progress on the cases. We continue to monitor that very closely. We have lawyers working on the cases and we are on top of the evidence. We do think that in the case of the bank chief executives, we will get convictions.
And stepping back and looking at the broader system, I mean, you said at the time we had to move to send a strong signal that such recklessness on the part of bank executives won't be tolerated. But 2 years on, is the system stronger and is it cleaner?
I think it is. First of all, we've gotten a lot of what you might call the rotten apples out of the system. Many of the bank CEOs that you have today are people who've run their banks very well. We've tried to improve governance and regulatory frameworks. We've put in term limits for CEOs and non-executive directors. We've put in enhanced disclosure guidelines and risk management principles. And we think the system is generally much better today than it was 2 years ago.
And yet you say the rich break the law with impunity.
Yes, I think they have broken the law with impunity, but I think the fact that we put in the CEO that we put in jail was one of the richest persons in Nigeria, and nobody expected, 2 years ago, she was untouchable. The fact that she could be convicted and forfeit assets suggests that the age of impunity is over.
And your security, I mentioned, was stepped up. Have you faced specific threats?
I wouldn't know. I keep complaining about this amount of security around me, and the security guys tell me that they know what they're doing.
Well, you complain because it's too much or too little?
I think it's too much. I think it constrains my freedom, but they're acting under instructions and they're acting based on information that they have, which they're not going to give me.
They don't need to give you?
They don't need to give me what information they have.
You're not interested to hear it?
I ask them and they say, look, they're working under instructions, they've got to protect.
Do you worry?
No, at one time I was worried, but I think at this point in time, the people that we are trying should do the worrying.
The former head of the Economic Financial Crimes Commission, Nuhu Ribadu, he fled when he made too many enemies and feared his life was at risk. He's back now, of course, in Nigeria, standing for the presidency, but is a spell in exile an option for you if things get too hot?
I don't know. I'll take the future as it comes. I do have no doubt in my mind that you're dealing with forces that will fight back. I don't know anyone who stepped on their toes and gotten away with it totally, and they're very strong people. And I do know they will get back one way or the other, and I just have to be prepared for whatever it is.
I suppose it can't hurt in terms of your prospects elsewhere that you've just been named London's Banker magazine's Central Banker of the Year 2010. Are you the right choice?
I don't know about the right choice. I think it's more a reflection of the enormity of the problems that we faced, and perhaps the fact that in Nigeria we took actions that have not been taken by other regulators, not just in terms of the CEOs, but also in terms of getting the banks to pay for the cleanup.
Well, let's talk about that then. Why haven't they been taken elsewhere? Should others be following your example?
I should think so. I'm amazed at the total lack of personal accountability in other parts of the world, given the amount of money that's been spent to bail out institutions.
And so you've named names in Nigeria who should be gone after elsewhere, in Europe or in North America?
I don't know, but I do think the regulators need to look very hard and ask themselves if people exposed their banks to this kind of risk, and if they took decisions, were they just issues of wrong judgment or greed? And if it was greed, were there any laws that were broken?
Yeah, because it's an interesting question, and since 2008, of course, public in various countries have watched in outrage as top bankers retire with huge payouts, and now the bonuses are back in a lot of big financial sectors. Taxation is still a problem, regulation is still skirmished over. The politicians talk a lot, but clearly in many jurisdictions they're finding it difficult to actually leverage that into meaningful action. Why?
Look, everywhere there's a very strong nexus between money and political power. And that is the reality. That's how the world works. When we started in Nigeria, we found that many of the bank CEOs that we're talking about had very strong connections in politics. It takes, I think, a decision to frontally to face these issues frontally and say you've got to break that nexus and hold people responsible for it to happen. It takes a lot of political will.
And yet the bankers, I mean, are talking their own talk now, coming back strongly. President of JP Morgan Chase, for example, Jamie Dimon, said at the World Economic Forum a couple of weeks ago, it is unproductive to bash banks. Chief Executive of Barclays as well, Bob Diamond, told British parliamentarians the time for remorse and apology from banks is over.
I think we should never let bankers forget how much they've cost the general public by their recklessness. And I do think it is for them to say that time for remorse is over. They should have remorse. Many of the things that happened because of very bad decisions taken deliberately by bankers. Shareholders made a lot of profit at the expense of depositors and creditors and taxpayers, and we should not let the bankers forget that.
And of course the banks say, well, we have to pay people big bonuses because otherwise talent will move off to our competitors. And as banking centres like the City of London, they say, well, if you tax us too hard, then we'll move off to other banking centres.
Well, the bonuses are not the problem, is it? I think the real problem is that we've had a situation in which the regulators themselves forgot what they're there for. If you allow the banks to use depositors' funds in the interest of shareholders and management and risk those funds and expose institutions to great risk, and you don't do anything, then that's a problem. The heart of the problem is poor regulation and poor risk management. If you have good risk management and you have good regulation, if the banks make a lot of money and pay bonuses, I don't have a problem.
And is there a key reform that you would like to see elsewhere? Of course, you have taken a firm stand on splitting retail banking from investment banking. Should that be done globally?
I think it was done after the Great Depression in the United States, and it worked very well until it was changed. And I think we should go back to that, yes.
And having talked about the mistakes elsewhere, what about yourself? Because banking awards notwithstanding, do you make mistakes?
Yes, I do, and I'm sure that when I look back over the last 2 years, I will probably see one or two things where I've gone wrong. But going back over the key decisions that we've taken, I think on all the big questions, we got it right.
And some criticise you for letting foreign banks take controlling stakes in Nigerian institutions. Do you worry about that?
Citibank was always in Nigeria. It was 100% American. Standard Chartered was always in Nigeria. Standard Bank of South Africa was always in Nigeria. There isn't a single new foreign bank that has come in, so I don't understand what the criticism is about.
What about Islamic finance? Because you've talked about developing elements, and you yourself have a degree in Sharia and Islamic study, which is fairly atypical for a banker of any description, let alone a central banker. But what elements of Islamic finance would you like to introduce, or have you introduced?
Well, certainly I'd like to see a number of Islamic banks come up, and I'd like to see Islamic banking products in the system, partly because the focus on the real economy and the restrictions on speculation and gambling make those products a bit less prone to volatility in times of crisis, and we've seen that with many of the Islamic banking products in different parts of the world. It also introduces diversification and a deepening of the market, and potentially makes Nigeria a hub for a unique range of products, Islamic banking in Africa. So I do think it will be a major benefit to the Nigerian economy and the financial system for us to develop Sukuk, for us to have banks, and for us to develop an Islamic money market.
So that's one big area of reform. We've talked about some of the others. But is your approach overall too broad? Are you overstretched? Are you getting too political? I mean, you've dealt with banking reform. Now you're talking about the power sector. Is it just too much for one man to handle?
No, I think it's extremely important to understand that at the heart of the crisis in Nigeria and the United States and the UK is the complete disconnect between the financial system and the real economy. The savings that have been mobilized into the banking system were being spent in the financial system itself, in the capital markets, rather than on industry, rather than on agriculture. 42% of our GDP is agriculture. Only 1% of bank lending goes to agric. 60% of employment is given by SMEs. Only 3% of bank lending was going to SMEs, small and medium enterprises. Now, it is important for us to tell the government that there is a need to create an environment in which small and medium enterprises thrive, make agriculture commercially viable. I'll give you a simple example. Take tomato production in Nigeria. 60 to 70% of the tomato we produce gets lost between the farm and the market. There is no investment in storage, in logistics, in handling, in processing. Now, until we focus on fixing the commodity value chain, we're not going to make tomato production commercially viable. So we've got to work in that sense with the Ministry of Agriculture. We've got to criticize government policy and have the right industrial policy for banks to lend to the real economy.
But you're nearly halfway through a 5-year term. How can you achieve all of this?
Well, we've started. I think in the case of power, for example, we were able to play a major role in restarting the power reforms. We've just released about 200 billion naira to the power sector. And we do think that power has a huge multiplier effect on the rest of the economy. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to complete our study of 6 agricultural commodity value chains. We're going to put in place processes for unlocking the commodity value chain and then unlocking finance into those value chains and increasing lending to agriculture from 1% to 10% over a defined period.
Analysts sometimes describe you as a tsunami. Do you like that image? I mean, tsunamis can create a lot of damage.
I think the way you respond to a problem is dependent on the enormity of the problem that you face. Anyone faced with the level of graft and abuse that we saw, we had a banking system that was on the verge of collapse. I basically had 2 options. One option was to do the Japan in 1980 option, which is to say this problem is so big, I shouldn't deal with it entirely and deal with it piecemeal. And then for the next 20 years, we've been it. The other option was to come out with it totally and deal with it the way it deserved to be dealt with. And that was what we did.
You sound confident, but I mean, you yourself have said that some of what you've seen in banking is just symptomatic of all that is wrong with the country. And you're talking about putting pressure on government. How much support in government do you have?
A lot of what I have done could not have been done without support from government agencies. I mean, the late President Erado in particular, when we started, was very clear that government agencies that were involved, the police, the EFCC, and the Ministry of Justice should give me support. And President Jonathan has continued with that. One of the most important points here is that we have an independent central bank that's autonomous, and we have had political authorities that have largely refrained from interfering in the work. And that has been extremely useful. And
you have to work hard at finding allies?
I have found a number of allies. Many people have been very quiet and very afraid. And I think what has happened is by coming out and confronting these, we've seen many more people come out and say, it is time for this country to change.
And talking of change, Nigeria, of course, about to hold elections at almost every level and a period of political instability before and after. Can you rely on support from the politicians in future?
Well, as governor of central bank, I try to avoid politics, but certainly there are things that I need to do, and I do need support of politicians. I do need the National Assembly for passing legislation. For example, I couldn't have had my bad bank without legislation from the National Assembly, and we can't prosecute without support from the politicians in government. So what we can hope for is that we have a transparent process that brings up a very good government, and that we improve on the process of selection of ministers and key people. And if we improve the quality of leadership, then things move in a positive direction.
And it's strange to say you avoid politics, because all of the things that you're describing involve enormous amounts of political leverage.
Yes, but you've got to avoid partisan politics. Yes.
If you don't get the support, will you quit?
If I don't get the support, then I have no business being there.
Well, let's deal with the politics head on then, because after the 2007 election, you said of the ruling party, the PDP, I think everyone knew they were going to rig the elections. Do you fear April's elections will be rigged?
Well, I do hope they won't. I certainly felt 2007 elections were rigged. I think anyone who denies that would be deceiving himself. I think we've put in, the government has put in place certain processes. We have a very good head of the Electoral Commission, Professor Jega, who's committed to free and fair elections. We will have to wait and see. All the sounds that have been coming out suggest that the government is committed to it, but the party primaries across the board have not been very good signs.
And coming back to the point about the fear of an uprising, or the danger of an uprising, 50% of young Nigerians unemployed. You said last year that they were a threat to the national economy. And that Nigeria, of course, as we discussed, is in danger if the right steps are not taken of being next on the list. But Nigeria, of course, had its democratic transition, more than a decade ago. That's why you're about to have elections. How can it be next on the list?
Well, until democracy actually translates into good governance, at the end of the day, that's all that matters, isn't it? You've got to address the structural issues of the economy. You've got to address the issues of poverty. You've got an economy that has so many structural deformities. This is an oil-producing country that imports petroleum products. We burn our gas. We don't have power. We've got hides and skin, and we don't have a leather goods industry. We've got a large cotton belt and import textiles from China. We've got to fix these issues
and with such a determination to fix them, you'd have thought, for you, after dealing with the central bank, having got yourself a reputation for cleaning things up, politics is the obvious next course, isn't it?
No, I think as governor of central bank and as an economic advisor to the government, I can make an input into economic policy and have other people do it. I don't have to do it myself.
And your grandfather, interestingly, you come from such a prominent family, is another alternative to follow the footsteps of him, Emir of Kano. You yourself, a royal career awaits.
Well, I have said that ultimately that is the ambition of every prince. I think that if you asked me if there was a particular post that I felt I wanted, that would be it, because that's where I come from and that's where I'll go back to.
Lamido Sanusi, thanks so much for joining us on HARDtalk.
Thank you very much.